Okay.
If you want to maybe just get
Just,
started,
I
introduce.
get started and then we'll just see if anybody shows up other than Jessica and Todd.
Otherwise, it'll be a lively discussion between the four of us.
Howdy.
Yeah.
Hey, Jessica.
Good, good. Okay, so we'll get started. Today's topic is gender role changes. Okay, and actually, I'd hope that some of the older people, because you guys are all youngers, would would add some perspective. So I'm going to be the old guy in the room, and take it on myself to kind of represent the changes. But I want to first, we're going to talk about role changes with the idea of like, well, what's involved in that? What are the things under the hood? We can point out some things we want to change and some things we want to stay the same. But also, I'd like to take a look at like, well, what does it mean when those things change? Because things don't change in a vacuum. All of the space is occupied, so to speak. And if you move one thing, it's going to move something else. And that may or may not be what, it's something that you want. We find that no matter what kind of changes we make, you could change, like the kind of car you have, or you change your clothes or something like that. That's all, but whenever you change those things, it means that if you have this, you don't have the other thing. If you put on one shirt, chances are you took off a shirt. Chances are, so in this whole gender role thing, I'd like to begin with what kinds of changes have you observed happening, in terms of gender role changes, as opposed to sex change, that's different. This is gender role changes. What changes have you guys seen?
I know that one of the first things that I mean, it had been out there. I mean, this isn't anything new, obviously. I mean, society's always a stream. So there's changes going on, but I really noticed it first with the discussion about language and pronouns. That whole pronoun thing became it was, and being someone who works in language, I was like, oh yeah, that's something. How do you deal with that? Largely, use of they and the appropriate, I guess, or corresponding verbs to that, was just interesting. And that for me, I realized it had reached, that was the personal side of it. And then I realized kind of how strong it was is when AP in the AP style book accepted they as a universal form in the singular, kind of, like, and people have used that for a long time. But it wasn't until these discussions were taking place until you could begin calling people they, regardless of if it was just a singular person. You say, oh, well, And so that was the first thing, that's when it, like, I was vaguely aware, but then it really, it spoke to me because I was like, I have to figure out how to do this, in my own work even.
Interesting. I'd like to come back to that, but I'd like to give Jessica a chance to roll out on this too.
I don't know, define a little bit more what kind of answer or insight you're digging for.
Okay, so my question is really, what kind of role changes have you seen in well, in your lifetime,
Hmm.
what kind of role changes have you observed? How have the roles of men and women changed as you perceive it?
Well, so my mother being a career woman, starting in the 80s, that was kind of what I saw as the start of that, women can have it all movement. I can have a family, I can have a career, I can be the head of my household. So I grew up with that, um, that gender trend in my childhood. And I have seen it now, maybe within the last decade or so, a bit of a shift, letting women know it's okay if you don't want all that. Maybe the family is your priority, and you're okay just not being as career focused as initially we were encouraging women to be at the same time as having a family. I definitely did see that because my mother chose both family and career. I didn't see her very much. She spent a lot of time at work. So I was a kid in the 90s and daycare was all the rage, and that's where I grew up. I grew up at daycare, not really with my parents. So that's kind of how I've seen some gender role or some roles changing, is that letting both genders of parents, men and women, know that you can focus on your family instead of your career, and that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I said thank you. That is very
Yeah.
insightful, because you're straddling kind of the change, and like you are a participant in the change, and a recipient also of the change. So that's very interesting. Anyone else? Our question for those of you who just joined us is, what kind of gender role changes have you observed?
A lot.
Okay, so tell us about some of them.
Dad died. My mother wasn't even on the farm listing yet. She wasn't allowed to. When I was my first job, I was pregnant, and after 3 months, they told me that I had to quit because I was pregnant.
Mm.
The parents of the school where I was teaching went to the school board and showed or asked why I couldn't, and they said it would embarrass the students. And they opened up their coats and they were all pregnant, about 6 of them. When I first got married, I could not get a credit card. I saw a lot of changes in jobs, whether it be on TV, whether it would be a first woman and a principal in the school. They didn't think that she could do it. I have seen that women assuming their roles almost have to be super outstanding to prove him or herself. I could go on and on, but yes, I have seen many changes. I have seen changes in men taking on and being aware of it. And I think that was very, very helpful for both genders, because it was a realization that we are all evolving into acceptance more and more.
Interesting. Great. Anyone else? Role changes, gender role changes that you have observed in your lifetime? Anyone else? Well, keep thinking about that, because I think that's the basis of our conversation, really, is what have you observed? And I will reflect on a couple of things that have been said. I think that it's very interesting, Lee, that you talk about the changes that happened almost kind of like when the beginning, going back to when women couldn't have credit cards, and of course I was young enough that I didn't have a credit card, so credit cards weren't a thing for me. But it's amazing the thinking, if you can call it that, that went into that idea that women couldn't have, credit cards. And I think that is an evolution also of how we see the role of women, in being subservient, not to just their fathers or husbands, but to men in general. I think like that kind of thinking is evolutionary, if not revolutionary. It's like to move out of that kind of thinking, to see women as whole, independent, full human beings. We can certainly see that at least from this side of that decision, that it was long overdue. But to me, that fundamentally was revolutionary, evolutionary. It's like just to, and I don't think we fully swallowed that pill yet. I still think it's one of those kind of pills, like, like sometimes the doctor gives you a pill and you think, how could I ever swallow that sucker? Because it's so big, or you get the pills that you swallow them, but if you don't drink a lot of water, they stick in your throat, I think that's kind of like where we are now with accepting women as full human beings. We kind of, at least on the surface, we swallowed it. We haven't really taken it in yet. At least that's my take, because there are a lot of subtle little things. And it's not just men that haven't taken that in. I think it's women also haven't taken that in. And you can see pushback sometimes in that. What was that lady's name? Shafley? She was one of the ones that came out just, like full force against the women's movement. She was the one that kind of drugged the ERA down, but she couldn't do it by herself. She had to have a whole bunch of women who agreed with her, and as a result, we still have an ERA that, what, it's like, that's like a, no-brainer, but not to some people, So that, that brings the question of how women see, and we have 3 women on the call or on the Zoom conference today. So I'd be interested in their, how do you see the pushback from other women, not just publicly, but like women who just say, well, that's, I really can't see that, I will say that I remember in Japan having conversations with Japanese women, and they're about feminism, and their approach was that women who talked to me, they said, well, we're seeing that Americans' idea of feminism is a step backwards for us, because here's all this whole list of things that we have, and they're saying we want to have that or give that up, but for us, this is these are like reasons to leave it like it is, because we learned to manage it, you know. And I could get into that later, but I'm interested in how the women on this Zoom call, how you see the pushback from other women, or do you see pushback? People who are around you, do you see the pushback of like, well, I think this women's movement's gone too far? Have you seen that?
I don't
I'm
think that
thinking, sorry.
I don't think that I've actually had the experience of that it's gone too far. I would say as women, my sense is that we can be very hard on one another with expectations because we are capable of doing it. I think if a woman or a man chooses to not do something, then we're maybe a little bit more judgmental of why they are not doing it.
Can you expand on that a little bit, Sherilyn?
If you have decided that you are going to work hard and kind of have a lot of balls juggling in the air, then I think if someone else chooses not to, or they choose to juggle their balls differently or less of them, I think we can be judgmental to one another about that and not give each other the grace that we should. And that's just, I think, part of the growing up of the women taking on more responsibility is, you know, we don't want to go backwards, I guess. And we also don't want women and or men to cut themselves short with the expectations of themselves. But then I think there's that fine line, right, where it can go over where our expectations are unreasonable, because not everyone has the same capabilities, man or woman.
Right. Jessica, you were going to say something?
Oh, I just thought I was thinking. Yeah, I agree with Sherilyn. There, like I was mentioning, you know, with when my mom was starting out in her career, it was, you know, you should have everything. You should have a family, you should have a career, you should take care of your household. But not everybody really wanted that version of that ideal. So yeah, just I guess with the women's movement, more so than making sure everyone is empowered and you can do everything, that's a big bite to swallow, is to expect to do and have everything. I think it would be beneficial to be like, just do what serves you best. If you focus on career and don't want family, rock on, you do you. Or if you want to focus on family or a combination, I think that what's important is just that we're all individuals and we all have, you know, our own goals and values, and we shouldn't judge if it doesn't match up with the you know, all supreme have it all ideal, if that makes sense.
Yep. Lee?
I think it goes both ways. Trying to look at the male side, being a female. I believe that our expectations are different. I hear of somebody whose wife had died or left, and he was with raising 3 children. He's raising those 3 children alone. Well, that's not too much different than a woman raising 3 children. And so I think we're still striving to understand that we are all human beings. And as a gender, we're in some ways different. We're needing the opposite or not, whatever. But just accepting of others regardless. And maybe somebody has a greater skill than another person. It doesn't mean they are that way because they are male or female. So I'm trying to see it from both sides of it.
Lee, you make me laugh when you say that because my spouse was in the military, and I remember, you know, with him away, doing a lot of things, but yet if a family, their soldier was a female and had left, it seemed as though everyone felt, not necessarily myself, that the father that was left at home with the children needed more assistance than the mother with the children, which I always found really interesting. But I agree, I think that's just still the understanding of who we are as people, and that I'm sure that father had as much ability to do it as the mother, but for some reason, and I think that those things are evolving. I'm older now, and I would be curious to know if, some of those things have changed. But yet I had to laugh when you said that. It made me chuckle.
Yeah. Crystal, you've joined us. We're talking about role changes and among the genders, and right now the question is, if you have seen any pushback for, against, loosely defined as the women's movement, though that's very loosely defined. But the changes is probably more accurate, changes in gender roles. Have you seen pushback? And if so, what kind of pushback, and how does it make you feel?
Good morning.
Good
Yeah.
morning.
I was listening in on Facebook, and then I was like, I better get on through the Zoom. The last thing I heard was juggling balls or something. I was like, what's going on?
Wow.
So, when I think about gender roles, like one thing that came to mind was like in our community for prayer. So usually when we start anything, we start with a prayer. And one of our gender roles is that the elder man is to be say the prayer. These days, there's not very many, like in our community, very many men that are at a lot of our events that we have. So I work for a domestic violence prevention program. And so some of the events we have, there's not a lot of men, but even at like some of our tribal district meetings, I'll looking for someone to pray. And I asked a lady once to pray for us, an elder lady, and one of the other women got mad and she's a little upset. And she said, it's the man that has to pray. But there's only a handful of men. And I asked each one, and they did, they politely declined. So it seems like some of our gender roles in that way are changing, like culturally. I know it might be, it's just something to think about. And it seems like nowadays there's more women that are working outside the home and that are being the main providers. Whereas in the past it was like, oh, the men are always the providers. But it seems like nowadays I see more of the women that are handling all of the duties, more so than, like in single parent homes, or even, in some homes, dads are staying home too nowadays and taking care of the kids because, even daycare prices are over the roof, and, you know, families are doing what they can to make ends meet, you know, these days. So I guess that's kind of my take on gender roles. And, you know, I apologize for missing the start of the conversation, but that's kind of what I was thinking about, you know, how times have changed, like for the women. And I don't know, sometimes even in my culture too, they'll say, like, if we're at a community event, and they'll usually say, well, the man should be the iyapaha, or the main speaker, that they call him. But again, there's very few that, you know, and if a woman has, you know, can stand up and speak and do the same thing, you know, which I don't mind doing, but sometimes it's like, okay, you have to just, if there's a man, then you just let them do it, you know, let them be the speaker, and you just kind of stand back,
Mm.
you know. But it's, so that's kind of a difficult part for me, because I think women have voices too, and that we should be allowed to, you know, in this 21st century. But some things are cultural, so we have to consider all those too, I guess. It's my 2 cents.
Sure. Yeah, well, you know, I think it's all cultural, you know, there are different cultures, but it's all cultural.
Yeah.
But as one of my mentors once said, this culture is like underwear, you know, you should change it every once in a
Yeah,
while.
yeah, change it. Yeah.
It's like, and they do change, you know, whether we like it or not. You know, it's I find it very interesting when people, you know, sometimes they use, I call the cultural argument, and you say, you know, like, find a culture really that is exactly the same as it was, let's say, 500 years ago. Some change fast, sometimes some change slow, and then some change more, let's say, immediately. But find a culture that, you know, that is the same, and usually they're not doing well, you know, because when life changes, culture is an adaptation to reality, really. People, they may not be the best solution, but they're the solutions they have at hand. People settle on that and they work that out. Then it becomes like a routine. Everybody gets the routine, and we call that culture. But when something else comes along, a new problem comes along, that thing that you did, if you stick with it, it could wipe your whole culture out. And then it's academic what your culture was, because you don't exist anymore, you know?
Right.
Yeah, it's like if you got everywhere years ago in a canoe, now there's a drought and there's no water in the lake. You know, that canoe is not going to do you much good. So you have to develop a new culture. You know? Yeah. So that's one of the things that I find that was interesting, a thread through the feedback that people have been given, is how language plays a part in gender roles, you know, starting with the they thing that Todd was mentioning, you know, like pronouns. And then just even the way we say things like, we refer to women working outside of the home. And we still have a certain sense that that's a kind of like a extra thing, you know, or we say working women as though the women who are in the home are not working. It's like, well, what is the definition of work now? You know, I mean, like, or when people say, well, they work hard, you're saying that person doesn't work hard? Okay, let's see you do that for, you know, a couple of days, see if you last. That's the first thing. But you know, I would like to explore if you guys have any other examples of how language perpetuates gender roles. How does it keep us, how does language keep us thinking about gender roles in a certain way? Lee, are you trying to get on? Oh, okay. I could read your lips.
I
Oh,
was
there you
trying, I was trying to get Kurt or Todd's attention. I
Oh.
want to, from a man's perspective besides yours.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, on the language front, I mean, most people, I don't know, but if you go back a little and think of how it's sustained to this point, it's interesting to me. Now, for men, it's always been the salutation of Mr. And then women was Miss and Mrs. because you had to identify whether they were married or not, which in the time that occurred, it was basically a sense of property almost. Mrs. was, when it began, it was a sense of property. When the women's movement of the 60s era, late 50s through the 60s and early 70s came, the term Ms. was introduced, but still, you still have differentials there. You still have Miss, Mrs., Ms., and Ms. then became like an identifier of, oh, must be a feminist, and it's just very odd to me that was, but still men just still carried Mr. There was no it really, if they wanted to if they were looking for an if they're really looking to an equal sense, they would have changed a Mr. to a single and married, and then you could have it all, because then you would no longer have that whole carryover. And there's no, and I always thought about that. I was like, boy, that was really unfortunate that if you chose to be a Ms., because, if you use that form, you still got identified as something different. I mean, it was such a tag. Whereas any man could be a Mr. Didn't matter if they were a complete bozo or, whatever, they were still just going to be Mr. And so I always thought that, language has a shortcoming there. Its evolution trails usually socially. And so when it shows up, that's when I start to take notice of changes, there has to be some change going on.
Yeah. Kurt, jump in if you want to.
Well, I have noticed changes, and actually when you talk about Mr., Ms. and Miss, I don't hear that. I don't hear Ms. anymore very often. I can't remember the last time I heard that in front of someone's name. And a lot of women that I know are married just go by Miss. When you're using the first name, they go by Miss. I work a lot with children in a volunteer setting at my church, and it's always Miss this or Mr. that, even though the marital status doesn't play into that anymore, from what I've noticed. So it's kind of evolved even since the 60s, 70s, 80s, when that was a thing. You had to identify yourself as a feminist by that. So that's something that I've noticed. The other thing that I've noticed is that it seems to be more acceptable for a man to stay home. I see that more often, both in the circles I run, when in social circles and in different settings, and in the professional settings as well, or some kind of way of switching off, because there's always a question in a professional setting. Okay, so when the child is sick, who stays home? Those kinds of questions and things like that. And it's from what I've seen, becoming more mixed with that.
Yeah.
I noticed if I'm discussing something with another person, and it might be something about what my head attorney has just said or my doctor said, they usually say, well, what did he say? Or what did he say? Talking about each one. And I said, she.
Sure.
I mean, it is powerful. It tells a person a lot. Words do matter. And our choice of words is really important.
Well, it seems like, I'm seeing what Todd was saying too, that, the language sort of trails, and if we're lucky, it catches up to what we're thinking, but it also has a feedback loop, whereas if we keep saying a thing in a certain way, there are assumptions that are made because we don't look up the words in the dictionary or anything like that. It's a lot through context. And one of the interesting ones is when we say they have German blood. There's no such thing as German blood, it's just blood. I mean, A, B, O or something, but there's no German blood, and you would think, well, no, it's a figure of speech, but it isn't. Those people actually think that there's something in the blood that makes them a certain way, and in some cases they think you can't cross the kind of blood because if you do, we don't know, but something bad is likely to happen, maybe not a blood clot, but something will happen. So I think in the same way, when we use words in certain context vis-a-vis gender roles, that we either break down or solidify a certain attitude toward the roles that the genders play. Any feedback on that? Have you seen the same thing or contradictions to that?
I know we were having a talk during one of our LGBTQ, we were trying to educate community, and we had a talk on pronouns, on what, how to identify and how people like to be identified, and how to approach somebody who might be a male but is a female, so that was interesting. And just because it can be confusing, we just like look at someone, and if it looks like a male, we think it's a male. If we look at a female and we identify them as a female, then we say they're female, but that person might not actually be a female. He or she might be a male, so that's important. That kind of throws a whole new mix into learning about people and the different types, everybody's own personalities and a lifestyle and who they are. So that's interesting. And then the fact that like my little granddaughter, she kind of looks like a girl to me, but we were out over the last weekend and some lady said, oh, what would he like? What would he like? And she kind of looked at me like she was just like, didn't know what to say. And she's like, Grandma, I'm not a he. And then, so we had to, her little sister had to say, she's a girl. That's not a boy. So we had to do that, go through that, and I saw the kind of the little hurt in her, the look in her face, she's like, she called me a he, so that was that's something, I guess, just to be mindful of, and I guess just correcting ourselves when we find ourselves in that type of situation, because I've done it too. I've seen little kids and say, oh, you're a cute little boy, and they're like, oh, it's a girl. If they don't have pink or blue, how do I identify the babies? So I guess all that kind of leads into I don't know, when I think about it, just leads into just trying to be understanding, I guess, of everybody's own identity, and that I guess we really do have to be mindful of those things.
Right.
Interesting.
This brings up a very interesting point, Crystal, in that, how much responsibility do we give others for assuming things about us, right? In other words, if I dress up, and I don't know how I would possibly do that, but if I dressed up to look like a woman, or when I say look like a woman, there, we have these cues that we take as shorthand, and partly because we have limited processing power. We don't have enough data, first of all. We don't have global data on everything. And then there's 7.5 billion people in the world. And in order to make sense of any interaction, which we will have at a random number of those, we make certain assumptions so as to move along, so to speak, just to live. Now, most of the time, those assumptions work out because they are based on the generality. But then when this other person who has the cues of a male, but is really a female, but they have, like, let's say they have short hair, girls can have short hair and guys can have long hair, but that girl doesn't like pink, she wears blue. She doesn't like skirts, she wears pants, and she likes plaid shirts, and she doesn't wear any kind of makeup or no earrings, or any of the cues, that we associated to tell me that that is a girl, right? And so you think, okay, that's a guy. And so you say, hey, what does he like? Because that's the cues you got. It wasn't that you're trying to insult this kid, it was the cues. But then that person felt like, wait, my identity has been attacked, And okay, we get that kind of in kids, but that's not just kids, that's adults too. They seem to expect that whatever cues that they put out, you should be able to see through those cues and figure out who they are, even if they haven't. So, yeah. So how would you say it? What do you think about a way to negotiate that? To negotiate the assumptions that we make about the gender roles? What kind of ideas would you have and how we negotiate, at least causing the least amount of harm or making people feel bad?
Well, what I try to do, and I'm not always successful at it, but what I try to do is to gather that data like what you talked about, Lawrence, together as much as possible, and to be as non-gender specific as possible until I know more about the person, the situation, and things like that. So that's what I try and do.
Mm-hmm.
Try to be observant. Especially if there's some cues that kind of point me to one way and some that point to another way, because you get all kinds of different people. If you were to talk to someone in an ambiguous way that was non-gender specific, they may take offense as well. So if you get it wrong, they may take offense. So just to be as observant as possible and take in as much data as you can when you first meet someone.
One thing that, is relatively new, though, is this sense of kind of a non-binary world. And for my kids and I and my family, we ran into this probably 10 years ago. We went on vacation for the first time. We've been there several times since because it's relatively close to here, to Thailand, and the whole kind of subculture of ladyboys. Ladyboys are not, they're not either, really.
Yeah. They're Benny boys. Oh, you got.
We had, we.
You cut out there, Todd.
Uh-oh, I'm lost. Oh.
you're stuck.
Yeah, I know. Sorry about that.
Okay, now you're back.
Yeah, I had to switch my server. Sorry.
Okay.
But there were servers, and so we had conversations, and they worked at the hotel. It's and it was that first kind of insight into having discussions where not letting my culture invade on however they identify. Now that's a much broader discussion, in society, but at the time that was very unique. And so we had a lot of discussions on it, and just kind of came to, that isn't common for Americans, but kind of a more neutral or neuter, the DOS of the D and Darren DOS kind of discussions of, they're people. That's what we had to come to eventually. It's just, they're people. Talk to them like people, and try not to throw gender into it, because we didn't have a definition for their gender. So if you go to the, the human side of it, it's liberating as someone, who wants to communicate with people. It's not easy though, because just like Lee said, our language is so ingrained in us that you feel as if you're going to slip up at any second almost. You're going to say something, oh, wait, I mean, or feel embarrassed about that or whatever. So really it's like, okay, I just have to be a lot more purposeful in how I communicate.
Our language is part of our culture. You're so right, Lawrence, about that. Culture really determines a lot. But our language in the last several years, yes, I've had a few years of life, but it has become so divisive. We have given words meaning that are divisive. Colors, red, blue, I never heard of that before. The colors, I know that was something that, why was blue and pink assigned to boy, girl? I don't know. It's divisive. Why do we have liberal and conservative? That's divisive. All of those divisive words are so evident in today's world. And I think it also affects the gender.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think part of what happens is the business of language is the business of parsing things. I mean, if we're not parsing things, we don't need nouns. And I don't know of a language that doesn't have nouns. And part of the reason is because we want to say this thing versus that thing. Now, from a Buddhist point of view, that is absurd, to parse things. But then we're not talking about Buddhism. We're just talking about how people move through the world. And particularly when they talk about themselves versus the world outside of themselves. And it becomes important for people identity, which we talked about before, to say, who am I? And then so you assign yourself certain kind of attributes. And when you do that to yourself, you're likely to do it to others as a way to distinguish yourself from the others. So therein, I think, it's kind of like a rabbit hole we slide down. And the question is, do we make more refinements in language, or as has been proposed, we don't make any, but then how do we talk about, what are the words that we say, and how does a person feel who wants you to know that they are Benaba'i, If they're Benaba'i, they want you, that's part of who they are, and they may feel like you're denying their Beniness, so so because I know people who are like transgender, they're friends of mine, okay? And when they make that gender change, it's an identity thing, you know, a lot of identity things, like this is who I am, right? So it becomes important to them that you refer to them as a she or a he, depending on what they feel their true identity is. And now they're expressing that. Okay. So if we don't make the distinction between male and female, you know, and they certainly are not benabai, you know, that's a whole different thing, you know. Though at the 50,000 foot view, you might think that, but once you get down on the earth, you realize, no, that's different, you know? So, you know, how does one negotiate those gender things? Or and the same thing with gender roles. You know, there are some people who are very proud of being a mother and a wife and doing those mother-wifely things, and that is their identity. And so they feel, you know, I have relatives like that, you know, that they feel like, well, this is my role, this is my spot in life. I know what I'm supposed to do in this corner. If I'm now marginalized because my particular kind of work that I choose to do doesn't have value, then I feel like people are looking down on me. So anyway, I just bring that up because I think it kind of adds something to the soup, or maybe complicates it. Maybe it overcomplicates it. How do you feel? How do you guys feel?
I think a lot of times, though, like people who strongly identify, as you've seen more of this, is because the way we communicate tends to be less like person to person and more electronic or by, you know, in contained spaces where they will often, to alleviate some of that, will push the pronouns ahead of them. So like if you see their name, it will say like she, hers, you know, like that, or they, them, or he, his kind of thing. Of course, that isn't always available, but it is something that you've seen evolve pretty rapidly in the past couple of years. It isn't, you know, before the past couple of years, that isn't something you saw really in any forum. And now it's pretty, I mean, relatively common to see people who have that strong identity, even if it's not, you know, transgender or other, you know, even people who are just like, you know, I want to make other people comfortable when they're talking to me. You should call me this kind of deal. So it's so much more in the consciousness because there's so much more there, sort of.
Sure. Very good point. And I would add to that it adds also a certain amount of complication, because there is an assumption once I tell you that you got it. And that, you know, language is one of those kind of things that we don't think about the grammatical structure when we talk. And we certainly don't add the other layer of this one was a they, this one was a he. I mean, if you go to a conference and people tell you that I'm a they, them, it's like, does that register really? You know, I mean, okay, if you got one person, yes. 2 people, maybe. 5 people, not so much. You know what I mean? So the question is now, do you expect, because, and for you, you've said it, right? You've put it out there. And so for you, you feel like, well, I was upfront about it, you know, it's like, I tried to make that, but this person insists on calling me a he, you know? So, you know, it gets, you know, I find it gets gender becomes tricky when it becomes identity. You know, it becomes, but how do you separate that? You know, when a person lives in that body and has been and feels certain things in that body, you know, and they're reacted to in the community in that body, how do you separate them from that body? Yeah. So where do you think we should go? What are some things that you would like to see, places you would like to see us go gender-wise as we move forward? Or do you think we've gone far enough? Too far.
You took us down the rabbit hole.
There you go. Yeah, we're sinking now. Oh.
Like, ooh.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are, these are complicated things, and that's one of the reasons that I like to bring them up in these kind of fora, is because there are things that we I think people think about from time to time because they bump their heads into them, but then it's like, oh, never mind. Then you go on to something different. That happens after one of these too, probably. But the thing is, it's like, I like to get underneath the surface and allow people to wrestle with these ideas and have other inputs, from people, because I think we're living in a world of gender transition, role transition anyway. People are changing roles. The odd thing is, like, that's always been happening under the surface. Even though we have these generalizations, you can go back through history, and whatever rule you think it is, you can find women were doing something different and men were doing something different. You can find different societies where men were the primary child caregivers, right? You can find that. So it's been happening somewhere in the world, but now where do we go? What is
Yeah.
it? Go ahead, Lee.
I don't mean, I've been reading Leonardo da Vinci book.
Mm.
And if you read the first 3 chapters, this is well established. And you know how many years ago that is. So it's not something new. If you have a chance, or I'll lend my book to somebody who wants it.
Yeah. What would you say? What were you saying is well established, Lee? I missed that.
Oh, the gender issue.
Gender
It
role
really wasn't
changes.
issue. It was accepted. It was done through the arts. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and you could see, I'm more conversant in let's say Japanese history than European history, but one of the things that I noticed early is that women were playing a stronger role in Japanese society than people ever think about when you think about Japanese society. For example, most people don't know that women were samurai almost from the beginning. They even had their own sword, own kind of weapon called nigita. And you see men later pick that weapon up because of its effectiveness. But you had women doing all these different kinds of roles. Though when you think of Japanese society, that's not what we see. And the same thing with like arts, where we have like crochet and things like that we think of as things that women do, but originally they were men's arts. Sailors did that as an outgrowth of knot tying. They developed a whole art form that we know as crochet and knitting, or earlier it was men who were wearing makeup, and then it's somehow the role changed, and now the women wear the makeup, and we see a guy wearing lipstick or something, we go, ooh, maybe I want to move back, from that guy. But these are role changes. And as you say, this is not new. The role changes are not new. They've been going on for a while. Well, we lost Ryan. I don't know where he went. Maybe he went to do a role change, or something. But it's been real, and we'll see you guys next week on a brand new show. We'll be right here because you're right there. Okay, see you.